In the winter of 1983, archival research expert David Dodge and former Baltimore police investigator Tom Dunn were searching for evidence of government corruption in public records stored in the Belfast Library on the coast of Maine. By chance, they discovered the library's oldest authentic copy of the Constitution of the United States, printed in 1825. Both men were stunned to see that this document included a 13th Amendment that no longer appears on current copies of the Constitution. Moreover, after studying the amendment's language and historical context, they realized the principal intent of this missing 13th Amendment was to prohibit attorneys from serving in government. So began a 7-year nationwide search for the truth surrounding the most bizarre constitutional puzzle in American history: the unlawful removal of a ratified amendment from the Constitution of the United States. Dodge and Dunn have uncovered additional copies of the Constitution with the missing 13th Amendment, printed in at least 18 separate publications by 10 different states and territories over 4 decades, from 1822 to 1860. In June of 1991, Dodge uncovered the evidence that this missing 13th Amendment had indeed been lawfully ratified by the state of Virginia and was therefore an authentic amendment to the United States Constitution. If the evidence is correct, and no logical errors have been made, a 13th Amendment restricting lawyers from serving in government was ratified in 1819 and removed from our Constitution during the tumult of the unpleasantness between the Union and the Confederacy. Since the amendment was never lawfully repealed, it is still law today. The implications are enormous. The story of the missing amendment is complex and at times confusing because the political issues and vocabulary of the American Revolution were different from our own. However, there are essentially 2 issues. What does the amendment mean, and was the amendment ratified? Before we consider the issue of ratification, we should first understand the amendment's meaning and consequent current relevance. The missing 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States reads as follows: If any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive, or retain any title of nobility or honor, or shall without the consent of Congress accept and retain any present, pension, office, or emolument of any kind whatever from any emperor, king, prince, or foreign power, such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States, and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them or either of them. At the first reading, the meaning of this 13th Amendment, also called the Title of Nobility Amendment, seems obscure and unimportant. The references to nobility, honor, emperor, king, and prince lead us to dismiss this amendment as a petty post-revolutionary act of spite directed against the British monarchy. In our modern world, anti-royalist sentiments seem so archaic and quaint that the amendment should probably be ignored, right? Nope. And if you believe this, search my YouTube video library for Queen Elizabeth. When you've finished viewing those uploads, come back to this one and finish watching it. In short, the British monarchy's influence and meddling in our government, from legal proceedings to our elections at all levels, poses as much, if not more, of a threat to our republic today than any time in our nation's history. Let's consider some evidence of its historical significance. First, titles of nobility were prohibited in both Article 6 of the Articles of Confederation, 1777, and Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution of the United States, 1778. Second, although already prohibited by the Constitution, an additional title of nobility amendment was proposed in 1789, again in 1810, and, according to Dodge, finally ratified in 1819. Clearly, the Founding Fathers saw such a serious threat in titles of nobility and honors that anyone receiving them would forfeit their citizenship. Since our government prohibited titles of nobility several times over 4 decades and went through the amending process, even though titles of nobility were already prohibited by the Constitution, it's obvious that the amendment carried much more significance for our founding fathers than is readily apparent today. In order to understand the meaning of the missing 13th Amendment, first we need to understand its historical context, the era surrounding the American Revolution. Today, we tend to regard the notion of our constitutional republic as benign, harmless, and politically unremarkable. But at the time of the American Revolution, King George III and other monarchies of Europe perceived our form of government as an unnatural, ungodly ideological threat, every bit as dangerous as communism was once regarded by modern Western nations. Just as the 1917 Communist Revolution in Russia spawned other revolutions around the world, the American Revolution provided an example and an incentive for people all over the world to overthrow their European monarchs. Although the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War in 1783, our mere existence threatened the European monarchies. The United States stood as a heroic model for other nations and inspired them to also struggle against oppressive monarchies. The French Revolution and the Polish national uprising were in part encouraged by the American Revolution. Although we stood like a beacon of hope for most of the world, the monarchies regarded the United States as a political threat, the principal source of radical government that was destroying monarchies around the world. They concluded that if the principal source of that infection, our constitutional republic, could be undermined, the rest of the world might avoid the contagion and their monarchies would be saved. Their survival at stake, the monarchies sought to subvert the United States system of government. Having learned that we couldn't be destroyed militarily, they resorted to more covert methods of political subversion, employing spies and secret agents skilled in bribery and legal deception. Because governments run on money, and most politicians run for money, money was and is the primary enticement to commit treason. Much of the British monarchy's counter-revolutionary efforts emanated from British banks. The essence of banking was once explained by Sir Josiah Stamp, a former president of the Bank of England. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequality and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with a flick of a pen, they'll create enough money to buy it back again. Take this power away from them, and all great fortunes like mine will disappear, for then this would be a better and happier world to live in. If you want to continue to be the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, then let bankers continue to create money and control credit. The last great abuse of our banking system caused the Depression of the 1930s. Today's abuses may cause another. The savings and loan and bank scandals illustrate the ongoing relationships between banks, lawyers, politicians, and government agencies. These scandals are a direct result of years of lawbreaking by an alliance of bankers and lawyers, using their influence and money to corrupt the political process and rob the public. You think you're not being robbed? Guess who paid for the bailouts, taxpayer? You did. The systematic robbery of productive individuals by parasitic bankers and lawyers, that's not a recent phenomenon. It's a tradition that predates the Bible and spread from Europe to the United States, despite early colonial prohibitions. When the first United States Bank was chartered by Congress in 1790, there were only 3 state banks in existence. At one time, banks were prohibited by law in most states because many of the early settlers were all too familiar with the practices of the European goldsmith banks. Goldsmith banks were safe houses used to store clients' gold. In exchange for the deposited gold, customers were issued notes, paper money, which were redeemable in gold. The Goldsmith bankers quickly succumbed to the temptation to issue extra notes, unbacked by gold. Why? Because the extra notes enriched the bankers by allowing them to buy property with notes for gold that they didn't own, gold that didn't even exist. Colonists knew that bankers occasionally printed too much paper money and found themselves over-leveraged and caused a run on the bank. If the bankers lacked sufficient gold to meet the demand, the paper money became worthless and common citizens left holding the paper were ruined. Although over-leveraged bankers were sometimes hung, the bankers continued printing extra money to increase their fortunes at the expense of the productive members of society. This practice continues to this day and offers sweetheart loans to bank insiders, and even provides the foundation for deficit spending and our federal government's unbridled growth. If the colonists forgot the lessons of Goldsmith bankers, the American Revolution refreshed their memories. To finance the war, Congress authorized the printing of continental bills of credit in an amount not to exceed $200 million. The states issued another $200 million in paper notes. Ultimately, the value of the paper money fell so low that they were soon traded on speculation from 5,000 to 1,000 paper bills for one coin. It's often suggested that our Constitution's prohibition against a paper economy, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, was a tool of the wealthy to be worked to the disadvantage of all others. But only in a paper economy can money reproduce itself and increase the claims of the wealthy at the expense of the productive. Paper money, said Palatia Webster, polluted the equity of our laws, turned them into engines of oppression, corrupted the justice of our public administration, destroyed the fortunes of thousands who had confidence in it, enervated the trade, husbandry, and manufactures of our country, and went far to destroy the morality of our people. Here's an example of an attempt by the monarchy and the banks that almost succeeded in destroying the United States. According to the Tennessee laws, in the 1794 Jay Treaty, the United States agreed to pay 600,000 pounds sterling to King George III as reparations for the American Revolution. The Senate ratified the treaty in secret session and ordered that it not be published. When Benjamin Franklin's grandson published it anyway, the exposure and the resulting public uproar so angered the Congress that it passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, so federal judges could prosecute editors and publishers for reporting the truth about the government. Since we won the revolution, why would the senators agree to pay reparations to the loser? And why would they agree to pay 600,000 pounds in silver 11 years after the revolution ended? It doesn't make any sense. Unless you assume that those senators had been bribed to serve the British crown. That would account for their fury when Franklin's grandson published their secret agreement to pay 600,000 pounds sterling as reparations for the revolution. To increase their own wealth, they betrayed their country and the American people. How is it that they weren't strung up as soon as their sedition was exposed? How unfortunate that the American people didn't take care of business when they had the opportunity. If they had, in the nearest public square, with plenty of onlookers and the press to bear witness, future elected officials would have thought twice when approached by Crown agents that offered wealth in return for treason. Don't you think? The Jeffersonians opposed the United States Bank from the beginning, but the Federalists, the pro-monarchy party, they won out, and it was established. The initial capitalization was $10 million, 80% of which would be owned by foreign bankers. Since the bank was authorized to lend up to $20 million, it was a profitable deal for both the government and the bankers, since they could lend and collect interest on $10 million that didn't even exist. However, the European bankers outfoxed the government, and by 1796 the United States government owed the bank $6,200,000 and was forced to sell its shares. By 1802, the U.S. government owned no stock in the United States Bank. The sheer power of the banks and their ability to influence representative government by economic manipulation and outright bribery was exposed in 1811, when the people discovered that European banking interests owned 80% of the bank. The U.S. Congress, therefore, refused to renew the bank's charter. This led to the withdrawal of $7 million in specie by European investors, which in turn precipitated an economic recession and the conflict of 1812. Sound familiar? There are undoubtedly other examples of the monarchy's efforts to subvert or destroy the United States. Some are common knowledge, while others remain to be disclosed to the public. For example, David Dodge discovered a book called 2 VA Law in the Library of Congress Law Library. According to Dodge, this is an uncatalogued book in the rare books section that reveals a plan to overthrow the constitutional government by secret agreements engineered by attorneys. This is one of the reasons why the 13th Amendment was ratified by Virginia, and the notification lost in the mail. There's no public record that this book exists. That may sound surprising, but according to a May 1991 article in the Gazette, the Library of Congress has 349,402 uncatalogued rare books and 13.9 million uncatalogued rare manuscripts. There may be secrets buried in that mass of documents even more astonishing than a missing constitutional amendment. In seeking to rule the world and destroy the United States, bankers committed many crimes. Foremost among these crimes were fraud, conversion, and plain old theft. To escape prosecution for their crimes, the bankers did the same thing that any career criminal would do. They hired and formed alliances with the best lawyers and judges money could buy. These alliances, originally forged in Great Britain, spread to the colonies, and later into the newly formed United States of America. Despite their criminal foundation, these alliances generated wealth and ultimately respectability. Like any modern member of organized crime, English bankers and lawyers wanted to be admired as legitimate businessmen. As their criminal fortunes grew, so did their usefulness. So, the British monarchy legitimized these thieves by granting them titles of nobility. Historically, the British peerage system referred to knights as squires and to those who bore the knight's shields as esquires. As the ancient methods of theft and subjugation gave way to more civilized means, the pen grew mightier and more profitable than the sword, and the clever wielders of those pens, the bankers and lawyers, came to hold titles of nobility. The most common title is Esquire, and it's still used today by some attorneys. In colonial America, attorneys trained attorneys, but most held no title of nobility or honor. There was no requirement that one be a lawyer to hold the position of district attorney, attorney general, or judge. A citizen's counsel of choice was not restricted to a lawyer. There were no state or national bar associations. The only organization that certified lawyers was the International Bar Association, the IBA, chartered by the King of England, headquartered in London and closely associated with the international banking system. Lawyers admitted to the bar received the rank Esquire, a title of nobility. Esquire was the principal title of nobility which the 13th Amendment sought to prohibit from the United States. Why? Because the loyalty of esquire lawyers was suspect. Bankers and lawyers with an esquire behind their names were agents of the monarchy, members of an organization whose principal purposes were political, not economic, and regarded with the same wariness that some people today reserve for members of the KGB or the CIA. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution sought to prohibit the International Bar Association or any other agency that granted titles of nobility from operating in the United States. But the Constitution neglected to specify a penalty, so the prohibition was ignored, and agents of the monarchy continued to infiltrate and influence the government, as in the Jay Treaty and the U.S. Bank Charter incidents. Therefore, a title of nobility amendment that specified a penalty, the loss of citizenship, was proposed in 1789 and again in 1810. The meaning of the amendment is seen in its intent to prohibit persons having titles of nobility and loyalties to foreign governments and bankers from voting, holding public office, or using their skills to subvert our government. The missing amendment is referred to as the Title of Nobility Amendment, but the second prohibition against honor may be the more significant. According to David Dodge, Tom Dunn, and Webster's Dictionary, the archaic definition of honor, as used when the 13th Amendment was ratified, meant anyone obtaining or having any privilege or advantage over another. A contemporary example of an honor granted to only a few Americans is the privilege of being a judge. Lawyers can be judges and exercise the attendant privileges and powers. Non-lawyers cannot. By prohibiting honors, the missing amendment prohibits any advantage or privilege that would grant some citizens an unequal opportunity to achieve or exercise political power. Therefore, the intent of the 13th Amendment was to ensure political equality among all American citizens by prohibiting anyone, even government officials, from claiming or exercising a special privilege or power, an honor, over other citizens. If this interpretation is correct, honor would be the key concept in the 13th Amendment. Why? Well, because while titles of nobility may no longer apply in today's political system, the concept of honor remains very relevant. For example, anyone who has a specific immunity from lawsuits which isn't afforded to all citizens, they would be enjoying a separate privilege, an honor, and would therefore forfeit their right to vote or hold public office. Think of the immunity from lawsuits that our judges, lawyers, politicians, and bureaucrats enjoy today. Consider the special interest legislation that our government passes. Special interests, that's a euphemism for special privileges, for honors. If the missing 13th Amendment were restored, special interests and immunity might be rendered unconstitutional. The prohibition against honors, against privileges, would compel the entire government to operate under the same laws as the citizens of this nation. Without their current personal immunity, our judges and IRS agents would be unable to abuse common citizens with impunity. If the 13th Amendment were restored, our entire government would have to conduct itself according to the same standards of decency, respect, law, and liability as the rest of the nation. If this amendment and the term honor were applied today, our government's ability to systematically coerce and abuse the public would be all but eliminated. Imagine a government without special privileges or immunities. How could we describe it? It'd be almost like a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Imagine a government whose members were truly accountable to the public. a government that could not systematically exploit its own people. It's unheard of. It's never been done before, not ever in the history of the world. Senator George Mitchell of Maine and the National Archives concede that this 13th Amendment was proposed by Congress in 1810. However, they explain that there were 17 states when Congress proposed the title of nobility amendment, that ratification required the support of 13 states, but since only 12 states supported the amendment, it was not ratified. The government printing office agrees. It currently prints copies of the Constitution of the United States, which include the title of nobility amendment as proposed, but not ratified. Even if this 13th Amendment were never ratified, even if Dodge and Dunn's research or reasoning is flawed or incomplete, it would still be an extraordinary story. Can you imagine? Can you understand how close we came to having a political paradise right here on Earth? Do you realize what an extraordinary gift our forebears tried to bequeath to us, and how close we came? One vote, one state's vote. The federal government concedes that 12 states voted to ratify the amendment between 1810 and 1812, but they argue that ratification required 13 states, so the amendment lays dormant in our history, unratified for lack of just one more state's support. One vote. David Dodge, however, says one more state did ratify, and he claims he has the evidence to prove it. With your daily digest of current events and commentary, this has been Headlines with a Voice.
Guess I'll just close my eyes.